Hello and welcome to Europe After Midnight. Tonight I want to ask you something gentle before we begin. What happens when an idea moves faster than the people trying to guide it? What happens when a single sentence, spoken once by one tired man in a cold field, travels farther and faster than he ever intended, until it becomes something he no longer recognizes? That is where tonight's story begins. Not with knights in shining armor, and not with kings. Those come later, in a grander telling, the one most people already know. Tonight belongs to the ones who came first, the forgotten ones, farmers and blacksmiths and widows and children, walking east with almost nothing, following a small man on a donkey who believed, with his whole trembling heart, that God had called him personally to open the road to Jerusalem. Before we start, if you enjoy these long, slow drifts into history, you are welcome to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you something. There is no pressure at all. And if you would like to, you can leave your location and your local time down in the comments. I always find it quietly comforting to imagine where everyone is tonight. Someone in a cold northern city, someone by the sea, someone half a world away, all of us settling in together to hear the same old story. So, if you haven't already, go ahead and get comfortable now. Dim the lights if you can. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is holding you up. The bed, the couch, the pillow beneath your head. There is nowhere else you need to be for the next little while. Nothing to solve, nothing to plan. Just let your breathing slow and let your mind drift backward, nearly 1,000 years, to a chilly November in the south of France. It was the year 1095. In an open field outside a town called Clermont, an old man climbed onto a wooden platform to speak. His name was Urban, and he was the Pope, the leader of the Western Church. He had travelled through France for months that autumn, gathering bishops and abbots for a long council on ordinary church business, taxes and discipline, and the small daily matters of running a faith. But everyone sensed something larger was coming. Word had gone out that on this last day, the Pope himself would speak, and that this time it would not only be for the clergy. So people came. Farmers left their fields, townsfolk closed their shops, knights rode in from the countryside on horses still muddy from the roads. The crowd grew so large that no church could hold it, and so a platform was raised outdoors instead, in the open air, beneath a pale autumn sky. We do not know his exact words. That is one of the strange, quiet truths at the heart of this whole story. The most consequential speech of the Middle Ages survives only in fragments, written down years afterward by men who were remembering, or perhaps only imagining, what had been said. But we know the shape of it. Urban spoke of Christians suffering far to the east, under the rule of Turkish armies. He spoke of Jerusalem, the city where Christ had lived and died, now held by people who did not share their faith. And then he made an offer that no one in that field had ever heard before. Any man who took up arms for this cause, not for wealth, not for glory, but out of devotion, would have his sins forgiven. The journey itself would be his penance. For people who lived every day beneath the shadow of judgment, who believed without question that their smallest sins might damn them forever, this was almost too much to hear. The crowd is said to have roared back a single phrase, "God wills it." It became the heartbeat of everything that followed. Urban was careful. He was, in his own quiet way, a planner. He set a departure date for the following August, after the harvest, so that armies would have grain to carry with them. He asked that only the strong and the well-supplied make the journey. He wanted trained soldiers, organised under proper lords, marching in good order toward a distant and difficult goal. What actually happened was something else entirely. Long before any noble had finished selling his land to pay for horses and armour, long before any of the great counts and dukes who would later lead the true crusade had even gathered their men, something else was already moving. It moved through village markets and roadside taverns, carried by wandering preachers who had never been asked to preach at all. It moved faster than any official message could travel, and it grew simpler with every mile, shedding all of Urban's careful conditions until only one thing was left standing: march to Jerusalem and be saved. And the very first people to answer that call, the very first to sell their little homes and sew rough crosses onto their sleeves, were not knights at all. They were the poor, farmers who could barely read, widows travelling with young children, old men who had nothing left to lose and everything left to hope for. They would not wait for August. They would not wait for anyone. They had already begun to gather around a strange and unforgettable figure, a small barefoot preacher from northern France, riding, of all things, a donkey. His name was Peter, and history would come to call him the Hermit. Before we follow him, though, it helps to understand the world he was born into. It was a hard world, one that, in its own quiet way, already seemed to be waiting for someone like him to arrive. So let your eyes close now, if they haven't already, and let's drift gently backward into that older, harder Europe, the one that made the People's Crusade almost inevitable, long before Peter ever climbed onto his donkey at all. As we continue tonight, there's no need to remember every name or date. Just let the story carry you where it will. Picture, for a moment, the ordinary village of that century. Not a castle, not a cathedral, just a small cluster of huts along a muddy road, smoke rising thin and grey from cooking fires, the fields beyond stretching flat and damp under a low autumn sky. This was where nearly everyone lived. This was the world Peter would soon call to Jerusalem. Europe in the late 11th century was not one country, and it did not think of itself as one people. It was a patchwork of small kingdoms and smaller lordships, each ruled by a baron or a count who answered, loosely and often reluctantly, to a king somewhere far away. Power did not flow smoothly from a single centre. It sat instead in the hands of whoever held the nearest castle, whoever could raise the most men with the sharpest swords. For the ordinary farmer, the king might as well have lived on the moon. The lord in the next valley was far more real and far more frightening. Society divided itself, in the tidy way people of the time liked to imagine it, into three simple groups. There were those who prayed, the priests and monks and bishops. There were those who fought, the knights and lords who held land in exchange for military service. And there were those who worked, the vast, quiet majority, the peasants who grew the food that everyone else depended on and who owned almost nothing at all. If you had been born into that last group, and most people were, your life would have followed a narrow and predictable shape. You woke up with the sun. You worked the fields your lord permitted you to farm, planting and harvesting, according to seasons that never changed no matter how hard the winters were. Your home was 1 or 2 rooms of timber and packed mud, shared some nights with your animals for warmth. Your clothes were undyed wool, rough against the skin, worn until they simply fell apart. Meat was rare. Most meals were dark bread and a thick, humble soup called pottage, made from whatever grain and vegetable the season allowed. And hovering over every single day of that hard, plain life was fear. Not the sharp fear of a single crisis, but a slow, constant undercurrent of dread that shaped nearly every decision people made. Fear of a bad harvest, which could mean starvation by winter. Fear of the Lord's anger, which could mean the loss of a home or worse. And beneath all of it, fear of something even larger, the fear of what waited after death. This was a deeply, genuinely religious age, not in the soft, comfortable way we might use that word today, but in a way that touched every hour of daily life. People believed, without hesitation, in heaven and in hell, and they believed that their own sins, the small cruelties, the moments of dishonesty, the days spent coveting a neighbour's harvest, were being tallied somewhere they could not see. The church did not let anyone forget this. Its bells marked the hours. Its calendar shaped the year, full of feast days and fasting days and processions. And its teaching was simple and unshakable. You would be judged, and the judgment could be terrible. For the wealthy, there were ways to soften this fear, at least a little. A rich man could pay for prayers to be said on his behalf. He could donate land to a monastery and have monks pray for his soul long after he was gone. He could go on a smaller pilgrimage, to a shrine a few days' ride away, and return home believing his burden had been eased. But for the poor, there was almost nothing. No money for prayers, no land to give away. Just the quiet, grinding certainty that death was coming, and that when it arrived, they would answer for every small failure of an already difficult life. Now imagine, if you can, what it must have felt like to hear Urban's promise carried into your village, even second-hand, even garbled and simplified by the time it reached you. March to Jerusalem, and all of it would be washed away. Every sin, every fear, not through years of careful penance, not through gold given to the church, but through a single act of devotion that even the poorest person alive could offer. Their own 2 feet and their willingness to walk. Let us pause here for a moment, because this is really the heart of why the People's Crusade happened at all. The great lords who would eventually lead the proper crusade had land to protect and estates to arrange before they could leave. They needed money, horses, months of preparation. Their commitment, though genuine, was necessarily slow. The poor had none of that. They had nothing to arrange, because they had nothing to lose. A farmer, with a single small plot of land and a family half-starved through a hard winter, did not need to consult anyone before deciding to go. He did not need permission from a steward or a debt settled with a moneylender. He needed only to believe. And belief was the one thing this age had in abundance. But there is something else as well. Something the great chroniclers of the time noticed even as they wrote it down with a kind of nervous unease. Many people in that century genuinely believed the end of the world might be near. Strange signs in the sky, comets, unusual weather, were often read as warnings. A gathering sense that history itself was reaching some final chapter had settled over parts of Europe in those years, and for people already primed to expect the world to end, the idea that Jerusalem, the very place where Christ's own story had ended and begun again, might soon be reclaimed, felt less like a military campaign and more like the fulfillment of something ancient and inevitable. So when word reached the villages of northern France and the Rhineland that a preacher had arrived, one who spoke not of complicated theology, but of a simple, burning truth, that God himself had called ordinary people to march, it did not feel to them like a strange idea. It felt, in a way that is hard for us now to fully imagine, like something they had already been waiting for. All that remained was for someone to give that waiting a shape, a direction, and a leader they could follow. And in the early months of 1096, in the region of Amiens, in northern France, that leader appeared. Small, sunburned, dressed in a rough woolen cloak, travelling on a donkey that would itself become the stuff of legend. And it is to him, gently now, that we turn next. He came from the region of Amiens, in the rolling farmland of northern France, and by every account of those who saw him, he was not a figure anyone would have expected to move a continent. He was short, he was dark-skinned from years outdoors, thin in the particular way of a man who eats sparingly and does not seem to mind it. He wore a coarse woolen cloak that never seemed to change, and he went about barefoot, even in weather that would have sent most people searching for shelter. He ate almost nothing. He drank only a little wine, and preferred, it was said, fish and bread when anything at all. And everywhere he went he travelled on a small donkey, plodding along at its own unhurried pace, as if it alone were unaware of the storm gathering around its rider. History remembers him as Peter the Hermit. The surviving records tell us surprisingly little about his life before this moment. Some later stories claimed he had once been a soldier, or a monk who left his monastery, or a man who had travelled to Jerusalem himself years earlier as a pilgrim and returned home haunted by what he had seen there. These stories may be true, in part, or they may simply be the kind of tale that grows up naturally around anyone who becomes famous enough. What we can say with more confidence is simpler, and in its own way more remarkable. Whatever he had been before, by the early months of 1096, he had become something else entirely, a preacher with a gift so rare that even the careful, sceptical chroniclers of his own time struggled to explain it. He could move a crowd to tears, and then, almost in the same breath, to action. Picture him arriving in a small village square, dust on his bare feet, the donkey standing patiently beside him. He did not need a grand church or a wealthy patron. He simply began to speak, and people stopped what they were doing to listen. He spoke of Christians far away, suffering under foreign rule. He spoke of Jerusalem, the holy city, fallen into the hands of those who did not share their faith. He spoke most of all of urgency, the sense that this was not something to be planned for next year or the year after, but something God was calling ordinary people to do right now, with whatever they had, however little that might be. And people believed him, not politely, not with the distant respect one might give a visiting bishop, but completely, in the way people believe something that answers a fear they have carried their whole lives. Some of the stories that grew up around him during this time have endured, even though we cannot know for certain how much of them is true. One tale claimed that Peter had travelled to Jerusalem some years before, and there, in a dream or a vision, Christ himself had appeared to him and handed him a letter, instructing him to return to Europe and rouse the faithful to reclaim the holy city. Whether such a letter ever existed, or whether such a vision truly came to him in the quiet of a Jerusalem night, the sources leave us no clear answer. But the story spread, and it did exactly what such stories tend to do. It gave Peter's ordinary human urgency the shine of something divine. Wherever he travelled, through the villages of northern France and onward into the German lands along the Rhine, people pressed close around him, not simply to hear him speak, but to touch him. They reached for the hem of his rough cloak, hoping some small blessing might rub off onto their fingers. Some, it was said, plucked hairs from his donkey's tail and kept them afterward as though they were holy relics, small fragments of something sacred that had passed near them. It is a strange image to picture now, in the quiet of tonight, a small, worn donkey standing patiently, while strangers gently pull hairs from its tail. But it tells us something true and important about how deeply people wanted to believe that Peter carried something larger than himself. And, in fairness to them, he told them exactly what they wanted to hear, though we should be gentle in how we judge that, because he likely believed every word of it himself. He told them they need not wait. He told them that armoured lords and appointed departure dates were not required, that God had called them, all of them, farmers and blacksmiths and widows alike, and that the road to Jerusalem was already open. Urban had set a careful, sensible date, the following August, after the harvest, so that people would have enough grain to carry with them on the long journey east. Peter's message carried no such patience in it. To the people gathered around him in muddy village squares, the road was open now, and waiting was itself a kind of doubt. There is no need to picture every face. Just imagine the feeling of standing among them, listening. You have spent your whole life being told, quietly and constantly, that you are a small and insignificant part of a vast and frightening world, that your sins are being counted, that salvation is something reserved mostly for the wealthy and the powerful, who could afford to buy prayers and endow monasteries on their own behalf. And then a strange, thin, barefoot man arrives on a donkey and tells you, with total conviction, that you personally have been called by God to walk toward the holiest city in the world, and that in doing so, every fear you have ever carried about your own soul will simply be washed away. It is not difficult to understand why so many people set down their tools, packed what little they owned, and began to walk. The crowd that gathered around Peter as he moved through France and into the German lands of the Rhineland was unlike any army the world had yet seen, and calling it an army at all is already something of a stretch. There were a few genuine knights among them, minor lords with little land and less money, men like Walter, who carried the rather unfortunate nickname sans avoir, meaning without possessions, which history has gently rendered as Walter the Penniless. But these men were the exception. Most of those who gathered around Peter were exactly the people we have already spent this evening imagining. Farmers who had sold their few tools for a little travelling money, tradesmen who simply closed their shops and walked away, women, children, the elderly, the desperate. All of them were swept along by the same current of hope and fear, the conviction that something enormous was happening in the world, and that Jerusalem was the place to be standing when it arrived. They had little food, They had almost no supplies, and only the vaguest sense of how far away the Holy Land actually was. There is a story, one that feels very true to the spirit of the whole strange movement, even if we cannot be certain of its details, that children walking with the crowd would point toward every large town they came near and ask, hopefully, whether this, finally, was Jerusalem. It is a small detail, and a sad one, but it tells us something important as we drift toward the road that lies ahead of us tonight. This was not an army marching with maps and supply wagons and careful plans. This was closer to a river overflowing its banks, thousands of ordinary lives pulled loose from their villages and set moving in one direction by nothing more than faith, urgency, and the quiet, magnetic conviction of one small man on a donkey. And before this river had even properly left Western Europe, before a single one of them had crossed into an unfamiliar country or met a single Turkish soldier, it would produce the first great tragedy of the whole crusade, a darker and sadder chapter than any battle that followed. That is where we must turn next, gently and with care, because it is a part of this story that deserves to be remembered honestly, even as we hold it softly. The message did not stay in Peter's hands for long, and understanding this helps explain so much of what followed. A movement this large, this fast, could not be controlled by one man alone, however extraordinary his gift for preaching might have been. Word of what Peter said in one village reached the next before he ever arrived there himself. Carried by travellers, by other wandering preachers who took up his message without his blessing or his knowledge, by simple word of mouth passed from one kitchen table to the next. And with every retelling, the message grew simpler, and a little more urgent, and a little less like the careful appeal Urban had made in that field outside Clermont. Urban's call, remember, had been layered with conditions. Wait until after the harvest. Bring supplies enough for the journey. Let the old, the sick, and the unfit remain at home. Monks needed their abbot's permission. Priests needed their bishops. This was meant to be an organised expedition, difficult and dangerous, undertaken by those who were genuinely prepared for it. By the time this message had travelled through a dozen villages and been repeated by a dozen different voices, none of that careful structure remained. What was left was a single, burning promise. Walk to Jerusalem and be saved. It is a little like watching a candle's light spread from one window to the next down a long, dark street. The first window holds the flame in its careful, original shape. By the last window, all that remains is the warm glow, no longer tethered to its source, but glowing all the same, and drawing people toward it just as strongly. Several bands began to gather in these early months of 1096, each forming around its own preacher or minor leader, each moving with roughly the same conviction that they need not wait for the great lords to finish their slow preparations. Walter Sans Avoir, the penniless knight we met a moment ago, gathered his own group and set off ahead of Peter's main body, moving down through France and into the German lands, with a small company that, though poorly supplied, at least had a little military discipline running through it. Other, smaller bands rose up around lesser-known preachers whose names have mostly been lost to us now. Ordinary men who felt the same fire Peter felt, and who found their own small crowds willing to follow them east. But it was Peter's group that grew the largest, and by the time he and his followers reached the towns along the Rhine in the German lands, the crowd around him had swollen into the thousands. It is difficult to say exactly how many, because no one at the time was keeping careful counts, and the numbers that survive in the old chronicles tend to grow larger with every retelling, the way numbers so often do when they pass through frightened or awestruck witnesses. But whatever the precise figure, it was enormous enough that feeding such a crowd, sheltering it, moving it from one town to the next, would have strained the resources of any properly organised army, let alone a loose gathering of farmers and pilgrims with almost no supplies of their own. And this is where we begin to feel the first quiet tremor of what was coming. A crowd of many thousands, with no organised supply train and very little money between them, has to eat. This is such a simple, practical fact that it is easy to overlook amid all the grand talk of faith and salvation. But it sat at the very centre of everything that would soon go wrong. When local markets could not, or would not, sell enough food to satisfy such an enormous, hungry crowd passing through, tension began to rise. Sometimes it was resolved through desperate bargaining, through townsfolk who took pity and gave what little surplus they had. But sometimes it was not resolved peacefully at all, and small disputes over bread and grain began, here and there, to spill over into something uglier. We will follow that thread more closely soon, as the crowd moves further along the Rhine and down toward the Danube. But before we reach that part of the road, there is a darker chapter we must pass through first, one that unfolded even before the main body of pilgrims had properly left the German lands behind. As bands of armed men gathered in the towns along the Rhine that spring, preparing to join the wider movement east, a terrible and twisted logic took hold among some of their leaders. It is a difficult part of this story to tell, and I want to tell it gently and honestly because it deserves both. Some of those gathering asked a question that the church itself had never posed and had certainly never sanctioned. They asked why they should travel thousands of miles to fight against those they considered enemies of their faith, when people they viewed the same way were already living, quite peacefully, in the towns and cities around them. They meant the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, communities that had lived in cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne for generations, settled, established, contributing to the daily life of those places in every ordinary way that neighbours do. What followed, in the late spring of 1096, was a series of massacres. I will not linger on the details tonight, because this is a story meant to soothe you towards sleep, not to trouble you further, but the truth deserves to be spoken plainly rather than hidden away. Thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were killed by these mobs of self-declared crusaders in acts that the church had never called for and that Pope Urban himself had never called for. His appeal, remember, had been aimed entirely eastward, toward the defence of distant Christians and the recovery of a distant city. But once that kind of violence has been given a shape and a direction, once a crowd convinces itself it is acting in the name of something holy, it becomes terribly difficult to control, and even more difficult to aim only where its leaders originally intended. In several of these cities, local bishops tried to help. Some opened the gates of their own residences and attempted to shelter their Jewish neighbours within their walls, sometimes at genuine risk to themselves. In places these efforts held, at least for a time. In others, the mobs broke through regardless, and the violence continued despite every attempt to stop it. Let us linger here for a moment and simply sit with what this meant. These were not soldiers trained for war, marching under strict military discipline. They were ordinary people, swept up in a wave of religious passion that had been lit deliberately by Urban and by Peter both, though neither of them had ever intended for it to burn in this particular direction. It is one of the oldest and saddest patterns in human history, the way fear and righteous urgency, once unleashed in a crowd, can turn against neighbours close at hand rather than the distant enemy that was originally named. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland would remember this violence for generations afterward, a wound that never fully closed, long after the roads to Jerusalem themselves had gone quiet. The main body of pilgrims did not linger in the Rhineland once this dark chapter had run its course. They gathered themselves, as such crowds do, and turned their attention back toward the road ahead of them, the long route that ran along the Danube, through the Kingdom of Hungary, and onward toward the distant walls of Constantinople. They believed, as they had believed from the very beginning, that God walked beside them, and that whatever difficulties lay ahead would surely part before them the way water parts before a boat. The road, though, had other plans, and it is to that road, the long and difficult one along the Danube, that we turn next. The road east from the Rhineland followed the same ancient path that pilgrims and armies had used for centuries before, running along the great curve of the Danube, through the green farmland of Hungary, and onward toward the edge of the Byzantine world. It was a road that had carried countless travellers safely in years past, But none of those earlier travellers had come in numbers quite like this, and none of them had arrived so hungry, so poorly organised, and so entirely unprepared for the practical realities of moving thousands of people across unfamiliar countries. Let yourself picture it for a moment, gently, the way you might picture a river seen from a hillside rather than up close. A long, uneven column stretching for miles along a dusty road, farmers walking beside their families, carts creaking under whatever meagre possessions people had managed to carry, the occasional mounted knight moving among them like a stone in a stream. Peter rode somewhere near the front, still on his patient donkey, and around him the crowd moved forward each day with the same mixture of hope and exhaustion that had carried them out of their villages in the first place. At first, the journey went reasonably well. Hungary, a Christian kingdom itself, had been given some warning that pilgrims were coming, and its king, a careful and practical ruler, was willing to allow them passage, provided they behaved themselves along the way and paid fairly for whatever food and shelter they required. For a time, this arrangement more or less held. Local markets sold what they could. Villages along the route offered what hospitality they were able to spare. It must have felt, in those early weeks, as though God truly was smoothing the road ahead of them, just as they had believed he would. But the arrangement was fragile from the very beginning, and it did not take long for the cracks to show. A crowd of this size, remember, numbering easily into the tens of thousands by the time all the different bands had merged together along the way, needs an enormous amount of food every single day. Bread, grain, whatever meat or vegetables could be found, all of it in quantities far beyond what any small farming town could comfortably provide, even with the best of intentions. Local markets, however generous they tried to be, simply could not keep pace with so many hungry travellers passing through in such a short span of time. And so, in town after town along the route, the same sad pattern began to repeat itself. Food would run short. Prices would rise, as any merchant faced with sudden overwhelming demand might naturally raise them, whether out of genuine scarcity or simple opportunity. And the pilgrims, tired, frightened, and increasingly desperate, would grow angry at what felt to them like betrayal from people they had believed would welcome them as fellow Christians on a holy errand. In several places, what began as arguments in local markets spiraled, almost before anyone could stop them, into something far more serious. Crops in the surrounding fields were stripped without payment. Livestock was taken. When local townsfolk or garrisons tried to defend what was theirs, the disputes turned violent. There are accounts from this stretch of the journey of pilgrims storming into towns, and of local defenders cutting them down in return. Sharp, brutal little skirmishes that had nothing to do with Turks or holy cities at all, but with an immense crowd slowly slipping beyond anyone's control. Here, a quiet but important pattern begins to take shape. So much of what went wrong for these pilgrims had nothing to do with grand battles or dramatic betrayals. Instead, it grew from ordinary human pressures that became impossible to bear, until trust gave way to suspicion, and hospitality slowly hardened into hostility. By the time the survivors of these early skirmishes staggered onward toward the borders of Byzantine territory, they had already lost a considerable number of their original company, not to any Turkish sword, but to disease, exhaustion, and clashes with the very people whose lands they believed they were crossing in service of a holy cause. It is a strange and sobering thought to sit with as we drift further into this story tonight. These pilgrims had left their homes believing themselves protected by something larger than themselves, certain that their faith alone would smooth every obstacle before them. And yet here, so early in the journey, so far from anything resembling the enemy they had set out to fight, the journey itself was already quietly unravelling them. Ahead lay Hungary's border towns, and beyond them, the walled city of Belgrade, where these small frictions along the road would grow into something far more serious. A conflict not with hostile locals defending their harvest, but with armed garrisons defending their walls. And it is there, at Belgrade, and in the difficult crossing that followed, that we will pick up the story next, as the weary column pushes further from home, than most of its travellers had ever imagined they would go. If the early stretches of the journey had taught the pilgrims anything, it should have been caution. It taught them, instead, very little, and the road ahead through Hungary and toward the Byzantine frontier would soon make that painfully clear. By the time the different bands of pilgrims, Peter's main group among them, along with the smaller company led by Walter Sansavoy, some distance ahead, had made their way deep into Hungarian territory, the goodwill that had existed at the start of the journey had worn thin in both directions. The pilgrims had grown accustomed to taking what they needed when markets could not, or would not, provide enough. And the local populations, understandably, had grown wary of columns of hungry strangers appearing on their roads, remembering all too well the trouble the earlier bands had caused. Walter's company, moving ahead of the main crowd, had already run into serious difficulty. Some of his men, growing desperate for supplies as they crossed into the borderlands, had turned to outright plunder in a town near the frontier, and the local response had been swift and violent. A number of his men were killed in the fighting that followed, a hard early lesson in just how quickly hospitality could curdle into hostility when a starving crowd met a defended town. Word of this violence travelled ahead of the main pilgrim host, the way bad news always seems to travel faster than good. And by the time Peter's much larger group approached the walled city of Belgrade, sitting at the edge of Hungarian territory where it met the Byzantine world, the atmosphere had already soured considerably. The garrison there, having heard what had happened to the north, was in no mood to extend easy trust to yet another enormous column of foreign pilgrims arriving at their gates. What followed was, in its own smaller and sadder way, a preview of everything that would eventually happen to this crowd on a much larger scale, further along the road. Negotiations over food and passage broke down. Tempers, already frayed from weeks of hunger and travel, grew short on both sides. And what had begun as a dispute over market prices and provisions escalated, as these things so often did along this particular road, into open violence. Fighting broke out between the pilgrims and the garrison at Belgrade, and the pilgrims, disorganized and lightly armed as they were, came off considerably worse for it. Here, a familiar pattern begins to come into focus, one that had already repeated itself several times over. This was not, this whole difficult stretch of the journey, a story of pilgrims heroically overcoming hardship on their way to a righteous cause. It was instead a story of misunderstanding piling upon misunderstanding, of hunger meeting suspicion, meeting fear, meeting violence, again and again, each time whittling down the size and the strength of a crowd that had left home believing itself invincible under the protection of God. Eventually, after this rough passage through Hungarian territory, and after further difficult negotiations and skirmishes along the border regions, the surviving pilgrims pushed on into lands controlled more directly by the Byzantine Empire. The Christian realm centered on the great city of Constantinople, a place most of these travelers had only ever heard described in awed and half-believing terms. A city so wealthy, so ancient, so vast, that it seemed almost more legend than reality. By the time they crossed properly into Byzantine Balkan territory, in the high summer months of 1096, the pilgrim host that eventually approached the imperial capital was already a shadow of the crowd that had first gathered around Peter's donkey back in the villages of northern France. They had lost people to hunger. They had lost people to disease, which spreads easily and cruelly through any large group living rough along dusty summer roads with little clean water and less proper food. And they had lost people, again and again, not to the distant Turkish enemy they had set out to fight, but to the very Christian communities along their own route, people who had, in the end, wanted nothing more than to protect their own harvests and their own homes from an enormous, unpredictable crowd of strangers passing through. It is a sobering thing to sit with, as we let ourselves drift a little further into this story tonight. This was meant to be a holy pilgrimage, blessed and protected, a journey that would wash away a lifetime of sin and fear. And yet here, so far still from Jerusalem, so far even from their first sight of a single Turkish soldier, the road itself had already claimed a terrible toll, quietly, town by town, market dispute by market dispute, long before the true danger of the journey had even properly begun. Ahead of them now lay the walls of Constantinople itself, and an emperor who had asked for a small band of disciplined mercenaries to help defend his crumbling eastern frontier, and who was about to find, arriving at his gates instead, something far stranger, far larger, and far more difficult to manage than anything he could ever have imagined receiving. It is to that meeting, between a careful, watchful emperor and a starving, hopeful crowd of pilgrims, that we will turn next. The Emperor Alexios Komnenos had, by the summer of 1096, been ruling the Byzantine Empire for some 15 years, and in that time he had learned, through hard and repeated experience, how to manage difficult situations with patience, careful diplomacy, and just enough generosity to keep dangerous people calm. He would need every bit of that skill now, because what was approaching the walls of his magnificent capital city was unlike anything even he had prepared for. Constantinople itself, in those years, was a city almost beyond imagining for anyone raised in the small farming villages of Western Europe. It held, by some estimates, 500,000 people, at a time when a large Western town might hold only 10,000. Its streets were paved. Its markets overflowed with goods brought from every corner of the known world. Its churches, crowned by the enormous golden dome of Hagia Sophia, held more wealth in gold and holy relics than most Western pilgrims had ever seen gathered in one place in their entire lives. To someone who had grown up in a small mud-walled village in northern France, arriving at the gates of this city must have felt a little like stumbling into a dream. And it was to this city, this vast and ancient and impossibly wealthy place, that the ragged remains of Peter's pilgrim host now arrived, sometime in the high heat of that summer, hungry, exhausted, and considerably diminished from the crowd that had first gathered around him back in the villages of France. Alexios, watching this strange, unruly mass of people approach his walls, faced exactly the problem he had feared, though in a shape he could never have predicted. Months earlier, he had sent ambassadors west asking Pope Urban for help, requesting what he genuinely believed would be a modest, professional force of mercenaries, soldiers he could pay, direct, and use to help push back the Turkish armies pressing against his eastern frontier in Anatolia. What had arrived instead, marching straight to his gates ahead of any organised army at all, was a vast, starving crowd of farmers and pilgrims, led by a small, barefoot preacher on a donkey, with almost no military discipline among them, and an unshakable, faintly alarming conviction that God himself was guiding every one of their steps. Alexios did what a careful, experienced ruler does when faced with a situation he cannot simply command away. He managed it. He received Peter with genuine courtesy, and he gave the pilgrim crowd gifts, food, and money, easing the worst of their immediate hunger and exhaustion. Here again, we see an approach that was entirely consistent with everything else we know about Alexios as a ruler. He understood, better than almost anyone of his time, that generosity offered calmly and deliberately could accomplish things that force alone never could. A well-fed, grateful crowd was far easier to manage than a starving, resentful one camped just outside his capital's walls. But generosity was only half of his strategy. Alexios also understood, with the same careful clarity, that this crowd could not be allowed to linger too long inside or even too near his magnificent city. These were people who, whatever their intentions, had already shown themselves capable of real disorder along the roads of Hungary and the Balkans, and Constantinople itself, with its enormous wealth and its dense, crowded streets, was not a place that could easily absorb thousands of hungry, unpredictable strangers without real risk of trouble. So, with all the smooth efficiency of a man who had managed difficult situations many times before, Alexios arranged for the entire pilgrim host to be ferried across the narrow straits of the Bosphorus, the thin channel of water separating Europe from Asia. and settled on the far shore instead. It was, in its own quiet way, a solution that suited everyone involved, at least on the surface. The pilgrims were fed, honoured, and moved swiftly onward, out of the crowded streets of the emperor's capital, and Alexios, for his part, was rid of a volatile and unpredictable crowd without ever having to resort to force against people who had, after all, come in the name of his own faith. Before sending them across, though, Alexios offered Peter and his followers something more valuable than gold or grain, though they would not fully appreciate it until it was already too late. He gave them a warning, clear and firmly meant. Wait, he told them, on the far shore. Do not provoke the Turks, who hold the surrounding countryside. The great armies of proper knights, the disciplined, well-supplied crusaders, whom Urban had originally called for, were still gathering far behind, still weeks or months away from arriving. Only once those armies had assembled, Alexios advised, should any serious advance be made into hostile territory. It was, by every reasonable measure, excellent advice, offered by a man who understood the military realities of the region far better than any farmer or preacher from northern France ever could. It was also, almost entirely, ignored. There is something quietly heartbreaking in sitting with this moment for a while tonight, this brief pause on the Asian shore, this last calm interval before everything went wrong. Here was a crowd that had already survived so much: hunger, disease, violent skirmishes along the roads of Hungary, the terrible darkness of the Rhineland massacres behind them, all in service of a belief that had carried them across an entire continent. And here finally was a wise and experienced ruler offering them the one thing that might have saved the rest of them: patience and the simple discipline to wait just a little longer. But patience, as we have already seen again and again along this long road, was never really what carried this crowd forward in the first place. It had been urgency from the very beginning, urgency and faith and the burning, unshakable conviction that God's will could not possibly require them to wait. And so, gathered now on the unfamiliar soil of Asia Minor, camped in a foreign land they barely understood, surrounded by a countryside that belonged, in truth, to a young and capable Turkish sultan who had not yet learned to take them seriously, the pilgrims settled in to wait, or at least some of them did. It would not last long, and it is to that final, fragile stretch of the story, the camp at Civitot, the raids that ignored every warning Alexios had given, and the terrible rumour that would soon send this entire weary, hopeful crowd rushing toward its end, that we will turn next. The camp the pilgrims settled into, on that far Asian shore, sat near a small coastal town called Civitot, a modest place that had never expected to become the staging ground for the final chapter of such an enormous, strange journey. For a little while, in those first weeks after crossing the Bosphorus, life there must have felt almost peaceful. The emperor's gifts of food had eased the worst of their hunger. The terrible violence of the Rhineland and the border skirmishes of Hungary lay behind them now, a hard and painful memory rather than a daily danger. Ahead, somewhere beyond the hills, lay the countryside controlled by the Sultanate of Rum, ruled by a young and capable Turkish leader named Kilij Arslan. And beyond that, though none of them could have guessed how far away it truly was, lay Jerusalem itself. But peace, for this particular crowd, had never lasted very long anywhere along the road, and it would not last long here either. The discipline that had never really held firm throughout this entire journey broke down further still. Once camped on unfamiliar soil with no experienced commander truly in control of the whole crowd, groups of pilgrims, restless after the relative safety of the crossing, began raiding the surrounding countryside that belonged, now, to the Turks, taking food and livestock much as they had done all along the roads of Hungary, seemingly unable, or perhaps simply unwilling, to understand that this was no longer friendly Christian territory where such behaviour might be met with mere anger and a skirmish. This was hostile ground, watched carefully by an enemy who had every reason to respond with far greater force. The crowd, never truly unified to begin with, also began splitting further into rival factions along old, familiar lines. One group, largely French, and another, largely German and Italian, each grew increasingly eager to outdo the other, whether in raiding, in plunder, or simply in proving which among them was braver or more favoured by God. It is a small, sad detail worth sitting with for a moment. Even here, even this far from home, even united by the same faith and the same impossible journey, old divisions of language and homeland still pulled at the seams of this fragile, hopeful crowd. Some of the more daring raiders pushed further than most, moving right up toward the walls of Nicaea itself, the Sultan's own capital, a bold and reckless action that can only have confirmed to Kilij Arslan just how little real military discipline existed among these strange Western pilgrims. One group of raiders went further still, seizing a small fortress in the surrounding hills, a minor victory that must have felt, in the moment, like proof that God truly was clearing their path forward just as they had always believed he would. It was not. Turkish forces soon surrounded the captured fortress and offered its occupants a choice: conversion to their own faith or death. Most, it seems, chose neither escape, and the garrison inside was killed regardless of the choice they made. It is a hard, small tragedy, easy to lose amid the larger sweep of everything that would soon follow, but it deserves a moment of quiet acknowledgement here tonight, because it was one among many such moments. Ordinary people, far from home, meeting an end they had never imagined when they first gathered around Peter's donkey back in the fields of France. Peter himself, watching his followers ignore every attempt at restraint, watching the raids and the reckless bravado spiral further and further out of anyone's control, seems finally to have given up trying to command a crowd that had, in truth, never really been his to command in the first place. He sailed back across to Constantinople himself, hoping to plead with Alexios for further help and supplies. As we drift closer to the end of this part of the story, one small detail quietly stands out. Peter, the man whose preaching had lit this entire fire in the first place, was absent back in the Emperor's city when the disaster he had spent months building toward finally arrived. Because in October of that year, 1096, the end came, and it came the way so many disasters do, not through careful enemy planning alone, but through a rumour. Word swept through the camp at Civitot that the German and Italian band of raiders, the rival faction to the largely French group, had captured the city of Nicaea itself, and was, at that very moment, dividing up the plunder among themselves. Whether there was any truth at all to this rumour barely mattered by the time it had finished spreading. What mattered was the reaction it produced, a surge of jealousy and urgency among the rest of the camp, a fear of being left out of glory and plunder that felt, after everything they had endured, finally within reach. And so the rest of the host, furious at being excluded, poured out of their camp, marching in no real order at all, toward the road leading to the city, the old and the women and the children trailing along behind the fighting men, exactly the disorganized, undisciplined mass that Kilij Arslan, watching and waiting, had been hoping to find. It is here, at this narrow, terrible turning point, hopeful rumour pulling an exhausted, undisciplined crowd out onto an open road toward an enemy who had been patiently waiting for precisely this mistake, that we must pause for tonight's final chapter of this part of the story. What happened next? On that road, near a place the old chronicles called Drekon, would bring this long, strange, hopeful journey to its terrible and sudden end. And it is to that end, gently, and with the same care we have carried through this whole quiet telling, that we will turn next. Kilij Arslan had been waiting for a long time, and he had been waiting with far more patience than the crowd he was watching ever managed to show. He understood, in a way that Peter's followers never quite seemed to grasp, that a scattered, undisciplined mass of people strung out along an open road is a far easier thing to destroy than a fortified camp. All he had needed to do was wait for exactly the kind of mistake that rumour and jealousy had just handed him. The pilgrims who poured out of their camp at Sivatot that morning in October, hurrying toward the road that led to Nicaea, chasing a rumor of plunder and glory that may never have been true at all, moved in no real order whatsoever. The fighting men, such as they were, walked at the front, while behind them trailed the old, the women, and the children, the very heart of the camp, the people who had followed Peter's call not for conquest but for salvation, now strung out along a dusty road with almost no protection at all. The Turkish horsemen fell upon that column at a place the old chronicles called Drakon, and what followed was less a battle than it was a slaughter. Kilij Arslan's forces were mounted archers, trained from childhood in a style of warfare the Western pilgrims had never encountered before and had no answer for. They did not close in to fight sword against sword, the way European knights were trained to expect. They rode close, loosed a storm of arrows, and wheeled away again before anyone could strike back, appearing and vanishing and reappearing from another direction entirely, as though the enemy itself could not quite be pinned down or reasoned with. For the poorly armed, poorly organised pilgrims strung out along that narrow road, it was a nightmare with no possible response. There was no line of soldiers to charge, no clear direction from which the danger came. The column was simply run down where it stood, cut apart in pieces, driven back in a full and terrible rout. Those who could fled toward whatever shelter the surrounding land offered. Many did not make it that far at all. A few hundred survivors managed to reach an old, ruined castle standing near the coast, and there they held out, barricaded behind ancient walls that had not seen real fighting in generations, until ships from Constantinople finally arrived to carry them to safety. There is something quietly remarkable here. Even in this darkest moment, some thread of mercy still reached them. Alexios, whatever complicated calculations lay behind his earlier caution, did not abandon these people entirely at the very end. But for most of the rest, there was no rescue at all. They were killed where they stood, or taken captive. Their long, hopeful journey from the villages of France and the towns of the Rhineland, ending not in the sight of Jerusalem's walls, but on a dusty road in Anatolia, cut down by an enemy they had never been prepared to face. The People's Crusade, which had set out from Europe tens of thousands strong, utterly certain that God walked beside every one of them, had effectively ceased to exist within months of leaving home, without ever once coming close to the city they had crossed a continent to reach. It is a hard thing to sit with, this quiet, terrible ending to such a hopeful beginning, and it is there, gently, that we will rest for tonight, before turning, in our final chapter, to what became of the man who started it all, and to the strange, lasting shadow this doomed march would leave behind. For Kilij Arslan, riding back from that road near Drakon, the victory must have felt complete and easy in a way that few victories ever truly are. He had faced the fighting men of the West, the warriors whose reputation had crossed an entire continent ahead of them, and he had scattered and destroyed them with what felt like very little effort at all. It was a reasonable conclusion to draw from the evidence in front of him. These crusaders, he decided, were a disorganized rabble, perhaps brave in their own desperate way, but no real threat to his power, no different in the end from any other undisciplined raiding party that occasionally troubled his borders. It was also, though he could not have known it yet, a conclusion he would have a great deal of time later to reconsider, because the people he had just destroyed on that quiet Anatolian road were not the army that Pope Urban had summoned back in that field outside Clermont. They were only the flood that had run ahead of it, the earliest and least prepared wave of a much larger movement that was even then still gathering, slowly and carefully, across France and Germany and Italy, under the command of great lords with money, horses, and real military discipline behind them. That army was still many months from arriving, but it was coming, and when it came, it would prove to be something entirely different from what Kilij Arslan believed he had already measured and defeated. Peter the Hermit himself survived. He had been back in Constantinople when the disaster unfolded, pleading with Alexios for help and supplies, and so he was spared the fate of so many thousands who had followed him east. When the proper Crusader armies finally did arrive at Constantinople in the months that followed, Peter rejoined them and marched onward with the lords and knights toward Jerusalem at last. But he was, by every account, a diminished figure by then, no longer the man who could gather vast crowds with nothing more than a word and a donkey. He was present at the end of that long, difficult campaign, when Jerusalem finally did fall, but he arrived there quietly, almost anonymously, one voice among many in a much larger and more disciplined army, rather than the man whose preaching had first set the whole enormous movement into motion. The bones of those who had followed him, though, remained behind on that Anatolian shore. Greek sailors who passed by in the months and years afterward reported seeing them gathered into a grim, silent wall by the Turks, a quiet marker of the place where the very first wave of this whole long crusade had broken and scattered. It is a hard image to hold on to, and I do not want to leave you with only that tonight, because as we come to the close of this long, strange story, another, gentler thread begins to emerge. These were not soldiers. Most of them had never held a weapon with any real skill in their lives. They were farmers, blacksmiths, widows and children who asked, again and again along the road, whether the next town they saw was finally Jerusalem. They left everything they had, not out of greed or ambition, but because a small barefoot man on a donkey had told them that God loved them enough to forgive a lifetime of fear, if only they would walk toward a distant, holy city they had only ever heard described in church. They were wrong about so much along the way, wrong about how far the road truly was, wrong about the country they were crossing and the people who lived there, both the neighbours they turned against in the Rhineland and the strangers who met them with hostility along the roads of Hungary. Wrong, in the end, about their own safety and about how easily faith alone could carry them past soldiers who had spent their whole lives training for exactly this kind of fight. But they were not wrong, I think, about the fear that sent them walking in the first place. That fear was real and old and shared by nearly everyone alive in that hard, uncertain century. And their answer to it, however tragic its ending, however poorly planned and badly led, came from something genuinely human and genuinely hopeful, the belief that even the poorest, most overlooked life might still matter enough to be forgiven, might still be worth an impossible journey toward the one place on earth that seemed to promise an answer. The People's Crusade is, in the end, a forgotten prelude to a much larger and more famous story, the one that would follow just behind it, with its knights and its kings and its long, grinding siege of Antioch, the story most people already know, at least in outline. But I think it deserves its own quiet place in memory too, not because it succeeded, because it did not, but because of what it reveals so clearly about the people who lived in that distant, frightened century, and about how far ordinary hope, however badly guided, can carry people who have almost nothing else left to hold on to. If you are still awake with me, there is another quiet story waiting for you, whenever you are ready for it, another road, another distant century, whenever you would like to wander there together. And if tonight's journey stayed with you in some small way, you are always welcome to like the video or to leave a thought down in the comments, whenever it suits you, and never because you feel you must. For now, though, let all of that wait. Let your breathing settle, slow and even, and let your thoughts loosen their grip on everything we have walked through together tonight. The fields of France, the long road along the Danube, the walls of Constantinople, the quiet shore where this whole hopeful, tragic journey finally came to rest. None of it needs to follow you any further than this moment. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let the room around you go soft and dim and still. Rest well tonight, and let whatever dreams come to you be gentle ones. Sleep well and sweet dreams.